Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a trip way back to ancient Greece to tackle the ultimate question: what exactly is the universe made of? We're going to dive right into the incredibly fascinating foundational ideas of Pythagoras and the atomic school, pulling directly from the historical insights laid out in the book Science and Civilization. Let's get started. So, picture this stunning setting. This is where early philosophers finally started breaking away from the old myths. They were looking for logical, structural explanations for the cosmos. You know, these majestic ancient ruins really remind us of a time when the Greeks stopped blaming every single thunderstorm or changing season on the whims of the gods. Instead, they actually started searching for the fundamental building blocks of reality. They desperately wanted to know the why and the how behind the physical world. And right in the middle of this quest, two completely distinct, powerful schools of thought emerged. And these two schools literally set the stage for thousands of years of scientific discovery. Now, you and I probably assume math is just a practical tool, right? It's something we use to measure fields, count our money, or build a house. But our first thinker, Pythagoras, he literally worshipped it as a divine, highly secretive cult. For him, mathematics wasn't just some handy way to describe the universe, it was the universe. His followers actually formed a hardcore religious brotherhood. We're talking strict ascetic practices, deep self-reflection, and closely guarded secrets, all completely centered around the mystical power of numbers. Section 1. Pythagoras and the Cult of Numbers. Pythagoras and his school didn't just study numbers on a chalkboard. They genuinely believed that numbers were the literal physical building blocks of all reality. They didn't see numbers as these abstract concepts floating around in our heads. To them, numbers had actual, tangible substance. They visualized them as having literal shapes, dots, and dimensions, which turned a standard arithmetic into a deeply mystical practice. They would arrange dots to form triangular numbers, square numbers, polygonal numbers. They basically built their entire worldview out of this geometry. Think about it. 1 point made a dot, 2 points made a line, 3 points made a surface, and 4 points made a three-dimensional volume. In fact, they held the number 4 in such high regard that they actually prayed to it. They called it the heavenly number that created gods and men, the ultimate source of eternal creation. No joke. And it gets even more fascinating. They actually gendered the universe itself. They viewed even numbers as feminine and odd numbers as masculine. They took this mathematical matching game to an extreme, assigning very distinct characteristics to different digits. For example, the number 1 was seen as the source of all numbers, so it wasn't even entirely a number itself in their eyes. But beyond that, this gender division really goes to show just how deeply they believed that numerical properties literally dictated the physical and even the social properties of the real world. They even went so far as to assign complex moral concepts to digits. For example, the number 5 symbolized marriage. Why? Because it combined the very first masculine number, which was 3, with the first feminine number, which was 2. 3 plus 2 equals marriage. And they definitely didn't stop there. They assigned the number 4 to represent justice. They believed the secret of health lived in the number 7 and the secret of love in the number 8. They truly, deeply believed that if you just understood the hidden properties of these numbers, you essentially held the keys to understanding human nature and the entire cosmos. Section 2. The Sound of Math. But listen, Pythagoras wasn't just a mystic with some wild ideas. His sheer obsession with numbers led directly to one of the absolute most profound discoveries in human history: musical harmony. This is where his mystical theories actually collided with rigorous experimental physics. He essentially proved that there really was a hidden mathematical order behind what we experience with our own senses. Legend has it he was just walking past a blacksmith one day and realized the hammers striking the anvil were creating beautiful harmonies. And it was based purely on the mathematical proportions of their weights, specifically ratios of 1, 2, 9, 8, and 6. He noticed that even though the men's physical strength varied, those harmonious sounds did not. So he goes home, perfectly recreates the experiment using vibrating strings, and realizes that musical notes are directly proportional to the lengths of those strings. Boom! He had discovered that the absolute magic of music is, at its very core, just a mathematical equation. Okay, but here's where it all goes horribly wrong for them. His perfect, totally rational mathematical universe was eventually completely shattered by a terrifying discovery: irrational numbers. Things like the square root of 2. The cult tried desperately to keep this a dark secret. See, the Pythagoreans believed every single line could be measured by a nice, neat ratio of whole numbers. But when they applied their own famous Pythagorean theorem to a right triangle with sides of length 1, the hypotenuse was the square root of 2. That's a number that goes on forever. It simply cannot be expressed as a simple fraction. According to the source material, this caused a massive existential crisis. Rumor has it that one of his disciples, a guy named Hippasus, was actually drowned at sea simply because he revealed this incredibly dangerous secret of the irrational number to the outside world. That is how seriously they took their math. Section 3. Enter the void. Now, let's pivot entirely away from mathematical mysticism. Enter a highly pragmatic philosopher named Democritus. He introduced two groundbreaking, purely materialist concepts that totally set the stage for a mechanical understanding of reality: the atom, which literally means indivisible, and the void. The source text points out that this was a radical departure from older philosophies. The old guys claimed the universe was completely full and that a vacuum was totally impossible. But Democritus? He stepped up and argued that without empty space, this void, movement itself would be absolutely impossible. Section 4. Democritus and the atom. So, unlike Pythagoras, Democritus argued for a universe that was completely mechanical. He stripped away all the mysticism, all the gods, all the hidden divine purposes. If you really want to understand nature, he argued, you don't look for some grand mystical design. You just look at the physical stuff the universe is actually made of. He proposed a brilliant thought experiment. Imagine slicing a loaf of bread. If you keep slicing it smaller and smaller, he said, you eventually hit a hard, unbreakable limit. These are atoms. They are solid, eternal, uncreated, and they are constantly whizzing around in empty space. Because they are eternal and uncreated, they elegantly solve that old philosophical problem that true matter can't ever change or be destroyed. Yet, because they are constantly moving, colliding, and bouncing off each other in the void, they perfectly explain all the constant change and motion we see in our everyday world. Democritus ingeniously deduced that these atoms essentially only differ geometrically, just in their shape and size. That means everything else we experience, color, smell, taste, is just a temporary illusion. It's just a byproduct created by how these atoms happen to arrange themselves. The source text gives a fantastic analogy for this. Think about the letters of the alphabet. By simply rearranging the exact same letters, you can change a comedy into a tragedy, right? Well, in the exact same way, the atoms in a piece of bread are simply rearranged by our digestive systems to become flesh and bone. The underlying atoms themselves absolutely do not change, only their temporary arrangement does. By boldly declaring that matter cannot be created or destroyed, Democritus essentially drafted the very first blueprint for the conservation of matter. He stated firmly that nothing comes from nothing. That specific concept is the absolute bedrock of modern physics. It is truly mind-blowing to think that thousands of years before we ever had microscopes or particle accelerators, Democritus arrived at this brilliant conclusion through pure, unadulterated logical deduction. Section 5. Two Pillars of Science. It's incredibly fascinating to step back and realize how these two ancient, wildly contrasting viewpoints essentially became the twin pillars of all modern science. We so often think of science today as this single unified method, but its roots are actually pulled from these two very different, fiercely debated philosophical directions. On one side of the ring, we have the Pythagorean legacy. This teaches us that underlying the messy chaos of reality is pure, elegant mathematical logic. This view tells us that the universe fundamentally speaks the language of math. From the harmonic ratios of music all the way to the complex equations governing planetary motion, the Pythagorean ideal constantly pushes us to look for that invisible, rational order humming behind the physical world. And then, on the exact opposite side, Democritus hands us the absolute foundation of modern physics and chemistry: a relentless universe made of nothing but physical matter in motion. His atomic theory might have been forgotten by a lot of people for centuries, but it eventually inspired the great modern scientists, folks like Newton and Dalton. It constantly reminds us that to really understand the world, we have to look at the physical components, the mechanical interactions, and the tangible, gritty matter that makes up everything around us. These two competing paradigms, perfectly laid out in Science and Civilization, have literally driven human discovery for millennia. This text brilliantly shows us that the history of science isn't just some boring list of facts. It's a rich, dynamic, ongoing story of how humans have completely shifted their fundamental understanding of reality, moving from pure myth to intense mathematical mysticism, all the way to atomic materialism. Which leaves us with one massive, lingering thought to ponder today. Are we truly living in a purely physical universe of bouncing, moving atoms? Or is everything around us ultimately just a grand, mystical mathematical equation? Think about that the next time you hear a beautiful piece of music, or even just touch a solid object. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.